sponsored by the Container Store. We're glad you came to hear tonight's lecture, Sleep and Circadian Rhythms, the Brain Benefits of Getting Enough Sleep, with Dr. Russell Foster, sponsored by Dianne and David Cash. We're expecting a full house tonight, so please be sure to move into the center aisle as much as possible so we can fill in the sides as other guests arrive. A few housekeeping items. For those of you in the auditorium, food and drink are not permitted in the auditorium. Please silence or turn off all cell phones and pagers. There is no audio-video recording or photography permitted. For those of you who valet parked your car, after the lecture, you can retrieve your car at the Center for Brain Health doors. We will be having a Q&A session after the lecture. For those in the auditorium, we will take a few questions from those who raise their hands. In the reception hall, please fill out the index card in your seat, and a Brain Health staff member will gather the question cards and bring them to the auditorium. Unfortunately, Dr. Foster will not be available for further questions after audience Q&A concludes. We are selling books by Brain Health scientists, the Container Store's founder, and February lecture speakers before tonight's lecture in the Brain Performance Institute lobby and after the lecture in the Center for Brain Health T. Boone Pickens room. Thanks again for coming, and please do not hesitate to let Brain Health staff or volunteers know if you have any questions or need assistance.
Hello. So glad that y'all are here tonight. I am Leanne Young, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Brain Health's Brain Performance Institute, the building next door that y'all did the reception in. And I am just so excited to be here tonight, and I appreciate y'all all coming. This is the second lecture of our lecture series, The Brain and Owner's Guide. I would like to see, is Melissa Rife here? Hi, Melissa is the CEO of the Container Store, so hold up your hands so everybody can see. I wanted to especially acknowledge her, but also, is there anybody else here from the Container Store? I know a couple people. Yeah. Thank you. So the Container Store is the reason why we are here for our 11th in this series. 11 years we've been doing this, and it's been made possible by the Container Store. This is an amazing partnership, and we are just incredibly grateful for the Container Store. And it's really kind of an organic fit for us, an organized life, a sharper mind. I don't know about you, but if I have to do any really deep thinking, I clear my desk, get all the distractions away, get organized, and then I can think clearly. So to me, this is such a natural fit, and so we appreciate the Container Store. I'd like to also express my gratitude to our sponsors for tonight, Dianne Cash and her son David Cash. Thank you so much for your sponsorship tonight. Very much appreciate it. So what we're talking about tonight is our sleep. And I don't know about y'all, but I find that, it's harder and harder to get that good night's sleep when we kind of are running on 24/7 schedules. We are doing stuff 7 days a week, and we seem to be busy and busier and busier. And one of the things that gets sacrificed is our sleep. And so this talk is, I think, really relevant to all of us. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Russell Foster, and I have to actually read about him because he has done so much. He's a professor of circadian neuroscience, director of the Sleep and Circadian Neuroscience Institute, head of the Nuffield Laboratory of Ophthalmology at the University of Oxford. That's the beginning. He researches the links between circadian rhythms, sleep disturbances, and disease. He works with psychiatrists and is helping to develop evidence-based approaches to stabilize sleep and reduce the severity of psychiatric illnesses. For those of you who have teenagers, this will interest you. He's doing studies on the nature of sleep disruption in teenagers and how we can develop ways to talk about sleep and educate youth on sleep in our schools. He is also he has written a book called The Circadian Rhythms, a very short introduction. This is available for purchase in the Pickens room. This resonated with me. His book highlights how variables such as jet lag, and he's probably got that tonight, variables such as jet lag and shift work can really affect our well-being because of how they affect our sleep. Really, one of the things that's really impressive about Dr. Foster's work is it's really translational research, and that's what at the Brain Performance Institute we're all about, translating our research so it comes out of the library and starts out of the laboratory and starts to affect lives. So that's why it's so exciting for us to have somebody here who's sort of a kindred spirit in that regard. We have a lot of great friends in the audience tonight. We have people here who've been longtime attendees, who are gracious supporters, who volunteer here, who really engage on our board. We hope that by you coming here tonight, if you're new to this community, we hope that you'll really engage and become part of our community. We're really all about really making the concept of brain health and performance something that is integral to our culture, just the way heart health is integral to our culture. We want everybody to really start to get on board with what we're doing, which really could transform our society. So if you're new to this community, look at the booths that are out there, go check out some of the books, talk to some of the people that have the blue badges, and really we invite you to really come back, become a part of what we're doing, and experience brain health and performance in your own life. So with that, I would like to really just turn this over to Dr. Foster, and thank you for coming here tonight.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, it really is a great honor and a privilege to be here, and particularly to give the Dianne and David Cash lecture. Before I jump in and talk about my passion for sleep, my profound interest in the biology of the sleep, I thought I would give a few introductory remarks that relate to how much time we spend asleep. It's just worth spending a little bit of time thinking about that. And this is some studies from the United States, which has defined how much time across the day we spend doing different things. And I think it's really worth pointing out that in these individuals aged between 25 and 54, that 7.7 hours, or 32% of the entire day, is spent asleep. And that is fractionally smaller than the amount of time both commuting to and from work and at work. So just that statistic on its own is telling us that sleep is doing something very important. And I think we should also be aware that across the lifespan, sleep increases from 32% to around about 36%. That's a prodigious amount of time. In fact, it's, in terms of the amount of time spent, it's one of the most important things we do. And I'd just like to sort of dwell a little bit on that 36%. Anybody here celebrated or about to celebrate their 60th wedding anniversary? Anybody? Yeah, okay. Well, I think it's worth bearing in mind that of those 60 years with your partner, 21 and a half of those years will have been asleep. So when you cut the cake with a big 60 on it, maybe it really should be 38.5 year anniversary. But the point I want to make, of course, is that the success of those 38 and a half years will depend a great deal on the quality of those 21 and a half years asleep. And despite this extraordinary amount of time that we spend asleep, we've marginalized it. We think of it as an indulgence and a luxury and something that we should dispense with. And Thomas Edison was truly a genius, and he commercialized the light bulb, and that allowed us to safely invade the night. And of course, as we've been able to invade the night, then sleep has been the first victim. And our attitudes towards sleep have changed profoundly as a result of this occupation of the dark zone. And Thomas Edison said, "Sleep is a criminal waste of time and a heritage from our cave days." So I want to try and convince you that he was right about many things, but that was one thing he was wrong about. It's also a view that is in stark and brutal contrast to the way that people thought about sleep in the pre-industrial era. Those of you who know the plays and sonnets of Shakespeare may recall some of the famous quotes. "Enjoy the honey-heavy dew of slumber. O sleep, O gentle sleep, nature's soft nurse, how have I frighted thee?" There's loads of quotes you can have from Shakespeare, but a contemporary of Shakespeare, Thomas Dekker, said this, and I think this is absolutely extraordinary. Sometime around 1600, he said, "Sleep is the golden chain that ties health and our bodies together." And he was absolutely right about that. Really what I want to convince you of this evening is that understanding the sleeping brain will help every individual, and I mean every individual, and all aspects of the society and civilization that we have built. So, let's now dive into the 4 topics I want to consider this evening. And the first is the biology of sleep, the nuts and bolts, and try and give you some sense of the complexity of sleep. The importance of light, which is often disregarded and ignored. Then, by understanding this biology and how complicated sleep is and its extraordinary vulnerability to disruption, what are some of the consequences of that disruption? But also, I then want to finish on possible actions. What can we do now? We're not going to put the 24/7 genie back in its bottle, so we've got to find ways in which we can mitigate some of the problems that are surfacing. And so we'll finish with some ideas that we could implement, I think, immediately. So let's kick off with the biology of sleep. And again, a statement. The quality of our consciousness is largely defined by the quality of our sleep. And that's a key point that I want to keep on hammering home this evening. So the first point is, well, what's going on whilst we're asleep? And what we know is that whilst we're asleep, the consolidation of memories, the processing of information, those facts that we retain are then manipulated, and we're using them whilst we're asleep, and I'll show you an example of that. And indeed, our emotional status can very much affect how we memorize things. And so really key aspects of our behavior are being influenced by what's going on whilst we sleep. Let me just show you 2, I think, really extraordinary examples. This is some work by Dianne Born's group in Germany. And I won't go into the details, but he developed a problem-solving task. And within this group here, he introduced the task to them in the morning and then asked them to perform the task in the afternoon. And about 20% solved the problem. The next group, he introduced the task to them in the morning, and they performed it the following day, but they were kept up all night. They had no sleep at all. And you see that, again, 20% of the group had solved the task. But these are the extraordinary data. This third group, they were introduced to the test in the morning, then they performed it the following day, but they were allowed to sleep naturally. And look at that. Some 60% of that group were then able to solve the task. And what this illustrates, and it was a highly statistical response, and what this illustrates so beautifully is that sleep promotes the ability to come up with novel solutions to complex problems. And of course, as a society, we've never more depended upon our ability to problem solve. And indeed, one could argue that sleep is perhaps the best cognitive enhancer we have, and we've got to take it seriously. But the other bit of data I wanted to show was that sleep aids the retention of positive experiences. This was a study by Sickold's group. And there was a normal group, they slept normally, and then there was a group who had been sleep deprived for 36 hours. And they were then they were presented with a whole bunch of different words, some of them with a positive content, joy, happiness, love, some with a negative content, war, hate, crime, and then words with a neutral content, words like cotton. I had to go back to the paper to try and remember what a neutral word was. So let's look at all the words put together, and this shows the percentage of how many words were memorized in the normal sleep. And you see that there's a big drop after the sleep deprivation. Perhaps not a great surprise there. But when you slice the data up and compare the different words, this is where it gets really extraordinary. So neutral words, there was a trend of not remembering neutral words as efficiently, but it wasn't significant. Negative words, there was a trend, but again, no significance. But look at this. This huge drop in the ability to remember positive words. And again, this illustrates the fact that if you're tired, you're going to not retain those positive experiences. Okay, so we've talked about some of the brain processing. Another really important aspect of what's going on in the brain is the clearance of waste products. And particularly recent data has shown the clearance of beta amyloid. And beta amyloid, of course, is one of those misfolded proteins that has been associated with building up in the brain and causing dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And I think many of us were slightly dubious of the data as it was emerging, but now it's solid. Sleep is absolutely an essential process in starting to clear these rather damaging proteins from the brain. And of course, other things that are going on, the regulation of growth and repair of tissues. Much of the tissue repair that the body needs is taking place whilst we're asleep and is being orchestrated by the brain, the replacing of energy reserves and the rebuilding of metabolic pathways. Clearly, with these few examples, you can see that these essential functions during sleep define, to a large extent, how good we'll be during the wake state. And because of the time we spend asleep and all these varied processes, it's no great surprise that sleep arises from an interaction of multiple brain structures. The hindbrain, the hypothalamus, the midbrain, and the whole of the cortex are all interacting to generate this sleep-wake interaction between consciousness and sleep. And it also is important to stress that all of the key brain neurotransmitters are involved at some level within sleep-wake regulation. So the key point is to be aware that sleep is a global brain event. And it's a very complicated behavior. And this is something I'm going to hammer on about as we go through today's presentation. Now, in addition to this sort of neuroscience here and all these circuits and things interacting and flipping from the two different states, there are key modulators which drive the timing of sleep. The first in our society is the alarm clock, social timing. So much of our sleep-wake behavior is being dictated, forced upon us by essentially the social demands of work and various other aspects. For example, if you have a young child. And these social demands can have a big effect upon our ability to sleep and wake. Then we have two key biological drivers. The first is called the homeostatic drive, and it's perhaps the most intuitive part about sleep, which is the longer you've been awake, the greater this build-up of sleep pressure and the greater the need for sleep. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And then the second driver, which is the biological clock, these circadian rhythms, which essentially timestamp everything. The master clock, and we'll talk about that also, is essentially saying this is the right time to be awake and this is the right time to be asleep. And these two systems have to interact appropriately for good sleep. And then the master clock within the brain is then communicating with clock cells throughout the entire body, throughout the liver, the gut, and all the rest of it. So what you've got is this extraordinary temporal or clock network throughout the rest of the body. But before we go on, I think we should explore in a little bit more detail the interaction of these two drivers here, the circadian clock and the homeostatic drive. Hopefully this will make it a bit clearer. So here we see just the homeostatic drive. Here's wake and here's sleep, and we see an increase in sleepiness on this axis here. So from the moment we wake in the morning, sleepiness builds up, and whilst we're asleep, it dissipates. Now, one of the things that has been associated with the buildup of sleepiness is a substance called adenosine within the brain. And why that's important is because caffeine in coffee blocks the receptors that detect adenosine. So the reason you feel more alert after a cup of coffee is that you're interfering with the brain's response to this buildup of the sleepiness drive. However, what we've also got to count for is the clock. So what the clock is doing is driving a rhythm of wakefulness. So what's happening is that fairly shortly after we wake up, the drive from the clock is fairly significant, but it's not huge, saying now you should be awake. And what it does is compensate for this build-up of sleepiness. So as we go through the day, the wakefulness drive builds up, and of course at this time of the day, your sleepiness drive is absolutely huge, but ideally, I can't see anybody asleep yet, you're not falling asleep because your biological clock is saying, no, this is not the right time to be asleep yet. But as we approach sleep, the wakefulness drive diminishes. During sleep, it's low, but then as we approach morning and wakefulness, the wake drive kicks in, and we wake up at this point here. And so what we see is this wonderful window of sleep. This is when sleep is most likely. And you can understand now that if you wake up during the first part of the night, it's easy to get back to sleep because the sleepiness drive is high and the wakefulness drive is low. But if you're woken up here, then it's much more difficult to get back to sleep because the sleepiness drive is diminished and the wakefulness drive is kicking in. And what's so important about this interaction of the two systems is that shift work and jet lag profoundly disrupt these two systems. So with jet lag, for example, your body clock is at one phase and yet you're chronically tired. And because the two systems can't interact synergistically, sleep is almost impossible or extremely difficult. So that's a really important aspect of this topic this evening. I've mentioned the biological clock, and I really can't help but show you a brain. Here's the eyes, and they project into the brain. Here's the optic chiasm. If we take a section through that part of the brain, and we look just immediately above, we see, for my purposes, the most beautiful structure in the brain, which of course is the suprachiasmatic nuclei, this paired structure, about 50,000 cells, the yellow dots here. What's truly extraordinary is that you can take one of those cells out, put it in a dish, and it will tick away. It'll show 24-hour oscillations. And so that's told us that the clock is actually the product of genes and their protein products interacting. And so we've got about 50,000 of those individual clocks ticking away, all coupled together, to produce a master biological clock within the brain that's coordinating all of this 24-hour activity in our physiology and behavior and, of course, sleep. So, we've talked about these various elements here. This clock is of absolutely no use at all unless the internal clock, is set appropriately to the outside world. And for setting the internal clock, you need an eye, which is exposed to a light-dark cycle. It then talks to those 50,000 cells and sets them to the external world. Of course, the classic mismatch between the external world and the internal world is jet lag. And you eventually get over jet lag because of exposure to the new light-dark cycle in the new time zone. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. The eye is also sending projections into the brain which directly affect one's levels of alertness. So the brighter the environmental light, the more alert you are. So if you're getting bright light before you go to bed, then this will increase alertness and then it'll take you longer to fall asleep. So light acutely is very important. And then we've got this other loop, which is talked about, the pineal and the production of melatonin. Melatonin is a biological marker of the dark. It is not a sleep hormone. It feeds back and basically reinforces the light signal that the eye is delivering. So you've got sort of a bit of a yin and yang of stabilization of the clock. So what I've emphasized in this first part of this talk is complexity. Absolutely extraordinary complexity. All those neural circuits, all those neurotransmitter systems, the fact that you might be a shift worker and forcing an abnormal sleep-wake cycle. You might be drinking too much coffee and therefore blocking the adenosine receptors and the sleep pressure, that you may have a biological clock that is fast or slow, and we'll talk about that later. You may be a morning type or an evening type. You may not be getting enough light to set that clock appropriately, or you may be exposed to too much light, which increases alertness and delays sleep onset. And so this complexity makes the sleep-wake timing system amazingly vulnerable to disruption. And the disruption that you see will impact upon overall health, our cognitive health, and indeed our emotional and mental health, and of course, all of these are linked together. And we'll look at some of the consequences of this disruption in a moment. But before we look at that, I want to talk about the role of the eye and the detection of the light-dark cycle. So the importance of light. So we're going to strip back all of those other components and just talk about the way that the eye is communicating with the biological clock, the suprachiasmatic nuclei. Now, this is a classic textbook picture of the eye, and light, of course, enters through here and then falls upon the retina. And let's just enlarge the retina. And the classic image of the retina is the pigmented epithelium, then the rods and cones, which give us our sense of black and white and color vision. Then the inner retina, which does the first stages of visual processing before you have an action potential in the ganglion cells, which then send their signals off to the brain. So that's the classic view of the retina. And we absolutely need our eyes and the retina to detect that light-dark cycle. And let me convince you of that. So what we see here are 48 hours, so 2 days, plotted for an individual. And we'll see this figure again. This is an unemployed individual, and you'll see why we've picked an unemployed individual. This is midnight, and they're going to bed a little bit later, and their get-up times are a bit wobbly. But you see a beautifully aligned rest activity profile in this individual. This is somebody who has no eyes. And we're working very closely now with Veterans for the Blind in the UK. And this is the ghastly tragedy. Those kids who've lost their eyes as a result of war can't lock the internal clock onto the external world, and so they're drifting through time, completely drifting rhythms. Okay, so we asked the question some time ago now, how does the eye and the retina detect that light? And I won't go into all the experimental details, but studies on mice and then humans showed that you can lose all of your visual cells, all of your rods and cones, but still detect light-dark cycles to regulate internal time. And that led to the discovery that we actually have another light sensor within the eye based upon those ganglion cells. About 1 out of every 100 ganglion cells, and these are the cells who send their projections off into the brain and form the optic nerve, 1 out of every 100 of those is directly light sensitive. And it's that system that's being used to regulate internal time. So you can be visually blind, but not clock blind, because you've still potentially got these photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. They are maximally sensitive to blue light, and in fact, although I haven't seen much blue light since I've been here, I am assured that often when you look at the sky, it looks like that. And actually, these cells are maximally sensitive to actually the blue of a blue sky, which is really fascinating. The couple of questions I want to ask is, well, first of all, how much light do we need to regulate the clock? And this is where it starts to get really interesting. If we look at the exposure to light levels in the environment, it goes from the very dim to the very bright. So moonlight's about 0.01 lux. A candle at 1 meter. A museum display case or sunset is really quite dim. It's only 50 lux or so. Offices between 300 and 400 lux. Near a window, 3,000 lux. Shady, 10,000 lux outdoors. And even in the UK, we can get up to about 100,000 lux. I think it was Bill Bryson who wrote this wonderful thing when he moved to the UK, and he said, living in England is a bit like living in a Tupperware box. You've got that sort of opalescent. Anyway, the receptors that are used, of course, are the rods to detect dim light and give us our black and white vision. The cones need more light, and they allow us to see in color. But the really extraordinary thing is that those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells need a lot of light for a long time. So they're in the 1,000 to 3,000 lux range. So light at which we could comfortably read by here or here isn't going to have much effect on regulating the clock. And let's bear that 1,000 to 3,000 figure in mind as we consider living in a modern cave. It may well be 3,000 lux at the window, but the time you get inside, it's reduced to 50 lux. So we're really attenuating light by living inside. And in the typical office, it's 300 to 600 lux. So these internal light levels are not really adequate for properly setting the clock. And not enough light can be a real problem. And the best study that illustrates that is by a friend of mine in the Netherlands called Aus van Summeren. And he looked at lighting in the nursing home. And it's a fantastic paper. This is hopefully the most depressing image you'll see this evening. This is at 20 past 2 in the afternoon in a nursing home, and the light levels are 20 lux. Remember that 3,000 lux value. Just ghastly. And what Aus did was increase the light to 2,000 lux by putting in these big banks of lights. And this was the sleep-wake pattern before, around about 200 lux, so fairly raggedy sleep-wake profile. After including the banks of lights, look at that. It's beautifully transformed. And critically, patients with dementia who showed stability of their sleep-wake rhythms, showed about a 10% increase in their cognition. So the extent and the contribution of cognitive decline in the aged because of poor sleep as a result of not getting a stable light-dark exposure, I think is a really important issue. And again, is something that we could address relatively easily. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the impact of ocular disease on human sleep-wake biology. Remember I said you can be visually blind, but not necessarily clock blind. So my colleagues in the eye hospital in Oxford have looked at a whole range of different eye conditions, cataracts, glaucoma, age-related macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, and have been asking a question, well, how is sleep-wake in these individuals with eye damage? And I don't have time to go into the exact details, but this is the summary. So there are two patient groups that we're studying. Those as a result of genetic disease who've lost their rods and cones, but have still retained their photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. And what our clinicians should be saying is that they should test to see if these cells are still there, and that's relatively easy to do. And if they are, then encourage individuals to expose their eyes to sufficient daytime light to regulate their sleep-wake timing. And this currently is ignored in almost all departments of ophthalmology around the world. And it gets even a bit more frightening, because what's been happening, it doesn't happen commonly, but it does happen, is that the clinician may say, well, I'm sorry, you're blind, there's nothing more I can do for you. And actually your eyes are a bit of a waste of space. What's going to happen is you won't see to look after them, you're going to gash them, they'll cause an infection, they're no use to you. So the simple thing would be just to pop them out and put a couple of these in. And so then, of course, completely unwittingly, this person's already lost their sense of space, but then, unwittingly, the eye removal will lose their sense of time. And this is a very serious issue that isn't fully recognized within ophthalmology at the moment. The other issue is, of course, patients who've got their visual cells, but they, as a result, let's say, have very severe glaucoma, which is now very uncommon in the developed countries, where you've lost the connection with the brain. And again, not all is lost for these individuals. They've lost the connection, so they've got no vision and they've got no circadian control, but they could be given medications to consolidate sleep. Melatonin has been used, and remember I said it gives you that dark signals, so 3 milligrams of melatonin at local bedtime has been able to partly stabilize individuals who've lost all of their eyes or with severe glaucoma. And again, I won't have time to talk about this, but we've been developing some new drugs which are going into humans this year, which can mimic the effects of light on the clock. And that's why we're working with the blind veterans to see if we can actually reinstate the sleep-wake timing in these individuals. So the take-home message here is clinical ophthalmology must appreciate that the eye provides us with both our sense of space and our sense of time. And that's a completely unexpected finding. We just wanted to find out how the eye is regulating the clock, and in the process discovered a completely new photoreceptor system, and that's now having a big impact. 39 million people around the world are completely blind, 285 million are visually impaired, and 246 million show low vision. So a knowledge about these extraordinary receptors could potentially impact the lives of millions of individuals around the world. Okay, let's now move on to the impact of sleep disruption. And the point I made earlier is there's immense complexity here. And the sleep disruption that you see falls into three broad domains. The first would be sort of short-term sleep disruption that many of you experience a few days, maybe a few weeks of sleep disruption. And what you see is loss of attention, high level of microsleeps, failure to process information accurately, impulsivity, loss of empathy, and a negative focus is really important. So, for example, the impulsivity, it was a really important aspect in the Chernobyl disaster. The Nuclear Commission, when they investigated that disaster, it was a bunch of young, sleep-deprived chaps in the beginning of the night shift who didn't appreciate the consequences of their actions. It was not a very well-made reactor, but actually their actions essentially precipitated the disaster. memory impairment, increased mistakes, reduced cognition and creativity. Longer term, the sort of thing you experience after several years, or indeed many years, 15 years or so, impacts on immune suppression, increased infection and cancer risk, increased cardiovascular disease, risk of diabetes 2, metabolic syndrome, and increased stimulant and sedative use. And we'll look at some examples of these. And the third domain is that if you have mental illness vulnerability, then sleep disruption has been shown to slide you into a more severe pathological state. So promotes mood instability, anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations in those who are vulnerable, and an exacerbation of symptoms for bipolar and schizophrenia. And we'll touch on many of these aspects throughout the rest of the talk. A few statistics. In the USA, 100,000 crashes on the freeway every year are related to sleepiness and these microsleeps. This is extraordinary. The 2010 Air India Express disaster is really very poignant, and luckily this little lad survived, and most people did not. And what happened is that the plane was coming into land, and the pilot simply fell asleep, and the plane hit the deck. How do we know he fell asleep? Well, because the voice recorder in the cockpit heard him snoring as this plane hit the deck. This is a great example of how the tired brain is impaired. So this is an fMRI, and there's going to be amazing brain imaging going on here in this center. But this shows the rested brain performing mathematical tasks, lots of activity going on, same individual after sleep deprivation, and that's the level of activity. I think it's a beautiful illustration of how the brain changes its capacity to function after sleep deprivation. And the problem of brains like that is that they then do this. So the alarm clock, and this is 7 o'clock. I know for many people it's going to be more like 5 o'clock, but this is a slide I produced for students, so they're 7 o'clock. So the brain, so the alarm clock drives you out of bed in the morning, and the second thing the brain will ask you to do is seek out stimulants, caffeinated drinks, and if it's a really naughty brain, it might encourage nicotine consumption. But the really important issue here is that substances like caffeine can last in the blood for 5 to 9 hours, depending upon your sensitivity, at fairly high levels. And so you've had a day fueled with caffeine, and then you're wired, and you need to get to sleep at night. So what do? Well, you take sleeping tablets or alcohol. And the really important point to make is that these are not biological replications of sleep. These are sedatives. And in fact, alcohol is particularly bad at suppressing the brain's ability to consolidate memories and process information. And so what happens is you get this appalling stimulant sedative feedback loop, which gets worse and worse and worse, and is sort of typifies the behavior of much of the developed and indeed the developing world. And this is the sort of thing we see in adults. But we've also got to be sensitive to the fact that many of our teenagers, many of our kids are doing this. So Red Bull Pro Plus is fueling the daytime activity. Over-the-counter antihistamines such as Phenergan, it passes the blood-brain barrier. So has anybody here taken Phenergan? I tried it because I thought it's there, so I'd give it a go. So I tried it on a Friday evening, and I think I must be really sensitive to these things because it wiped me out for Saturday. And it's really interesting. These are just over-the-counter antihistamines. And then, of course, there's the stealing of parental alcohol. So this is something that impacts across all sectors of society. Appetite can be hugely influenced by one's sleep status. So the biology here is that the stomach produces ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone. It reaches the brain. It promotes appetite and particularly the consumption of carbohydrates and weight gain. But under normal circumstances, this is balanced by leptin, which is the satiation hormone, reaches the brain and actually reduces appetite. And incidentally, this is actually me before and. I don't think there's any need to be quite so cruel about that. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that sleep disruption hugely distorts the axis towards ghrelin release. And Ev Van Couten at the University of Chicago has done some brilliant work showing that even relatively short duration, 7 days of restricted sleep in young males, can increase levels of ghrelin by 27%. Carbohydrate consumption after 7 days went up by 35 to 40%, and their ability to clear glucose from the circulation was bordering on the diabetic, and leptin was down by 17%. So a big impact of sleep disruption on appetite. And we'll come back to this issue later on. And the final bit of disruption I want to talk about is on the stress axis. So, of course, short-term stress is brilliant. It prepares us to fight or flight, to focus, to function, and drives physiology way outside of its normal range to deal with an immediate emergency situation. The problem with chronic sleep disruption is that it causes chronic stress hormone release. And the release of cortisol, for example, is associated with, you're throwing glucose into the circulation for the fight or flight response, but of course you're not burning it up, so there's the glucose intolerance, predisposition for diabetes 2 and other metabolic problems. Heart disease and stroke, you're increasing blood pressure. Reduced immunity. The one thing we know about high levels of cortisol is they reduce the immune system, and it may be that that's causing the increased levels of infection and cancer. Of course, stomach ulcers, abnormal digestion, anxiety, mood, instability, and depression, very common features of long-term stress, and indeed, cortisol long-term will impair memory. So again, sleep disruption can have a big effect upon the stress axis. The majority of psychiatric patients report clinically significant insomnia. In published cases such as this, it's greater than 80%. In our studies on schizophrenia and other severe mental illnesses, it's closer to 100%. It is quite extraordinary. And in fact, I just want to show you how bad sleep and circadian rhythm disruption is in schizophrenia. There's some studies we published a few years ago. Here's our unemployed individual. That's why we've used an unemployed individual, because most people with schizophrenia are also unemployed. That was the logic. So again, just to reference you, here's midnight. This is some hormonal profiles, and they're broadly stable in the middle of the night. And look at these patients with schizophrenia. It is unbelievable. This is the best one we saw, with so much activity occurring after midnight, delayed and wobbly hormonal profiles. This person was drifting through time. This person sort of hung on and then fell apart, again falling apart, and this person showed no 24-hour patterns at all. So it's not just sleep is bad in this particular sector, but it's appalling. And the extent to which the sleep-wake disruption is also exaggerating all the health problems and the cognitive problems in conditions like schizophrenia is largely ignored. It's really fascinating. One of the things that we've been trying to play with has been trying to look at the impact of improving sleep in individuals showing signs of mental illness. And I'll just show you a bit of a paper that we published, led by my colleague who's a psychiatrist in Oxford, Dan Freeman, amazing chap, published last October. And this was essentially taking individuals with insomnia, and we looked at almost 4,000 participants, students from around the UK, and they were randomly assigned to either no intervention or an online digital cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really quite exciting, because then you can deliver CBT to large numbers of individuals, and then looked at the impact of this CBT on insomnia, paranoia, and hallucinatory experiences. And I'll just show you one bit of the data. This shows the control group, and we're looking at levels of paranoia at the beginning of the experiment, 10 weeks and 22 weeks, and you see no significant change in the levels of paranoia. However, if we look at those individuals that had CBT and an improvement of their sleep, we see that levels of paranoia halved. So I think this is really exciting, because we can think of the sleep-wake systems as being a new therapeutic target to reduce some of the severity that you see in these chronic and debilitating conditions. A partial reduction in insomnia with digital CBT reduces paranoia and hallucinatory experiences. Okay, so how are we doing for time? Oh, can I continue a bit? 5 minutes, okay. I'll do my best. Let's think about some possible interventions and actions. And there's lots we could think about. And I just want to go through these 6, and I promise I can do it in just about 5 minutes, examples. So what do I mean by chronotype individuals? So as you will be aware, there are morning types and there are evening types. And you can actually assess what type of person you are by going online, just Google the Munich Sleep Questionnaire. And we know that the chronotype, morningness and eveningness, is affected by an individual's genetics, whether they have subtle changes in some of those clock genes, whether they're young or old. Young people tend to be later, old people tend to be earlier, but also the time of natural light exposure, which I'll talk about in a moment. And if we look at the population that's been studied so far, and this represents tens of thousands of individuals from an online questionnaire, we see a beautiful curve here. Here's the extreme larks, the morning types, here's the owls, and most of us sort of sit in the middle. Now, the difference between biological time when you want to get up, let's say on free days or when you're on holiday, vacation, versus the external requirements when you're forced to get up as a result of work, let's say, is called social jet lag. That's the difference between the biological when you want to get up and when the alarm clock is driving you out of bed. And it's really interesting because the greater the social jet lag, the greater the misalignment with your biology, with the demands that you're putting upon it, increases the chances of poor health, obesity or diabetes, worse mood, increased sleepiness, increased fatigue, increased risk of smoking and alcohol consumption, which we touched on earlier, and heart disease. This is extraordinary. Each hour of social jet lag is associated with an 11% increase in the likelihood of heart disease. So we're thinking about solutions here. Oh, and of course, the point I want to make is an owl on the morning shift will suffer much more than a lark, of course. So knowing that, why don't we chronotype the workforce? If we've got an industry that is going to be working across the 24/7, we identify those individuals who are morning types that would be best suited for the morning shift, the day shift, and of course, the evening shift. So we're minimizing that social jet lag and therefore reducing the chances of problems. So that's one thing we could do now. Higher frequency health checks. This seems to me so obvious. It's all about catching problems early. We've talked about the fact that night shift workers and those with disrupted sleep-wake, airline pilots, increased cardiovascular disease, cancer, obesity, risk of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, gastrointestinal problems. Why don't we have early and frequent screening for those at risk for these conditions? And let's just look at cancer. And many of you will be familiar with these statistics. If you catch early stage cancer for breast, prostate, cervical, or colorectal, there's a very high chance after 5 years you'll still be alive. But if you get late stage, then your chances of survival drop hugely. So it stands to reason we must institute higher frequency health checks in those individuals who are vulnerable. Why not introduce higher frequency health checks? Correct lighting. So this is kind of interesting. Lighting is complicated. But when you're exposed to light is absolutely critical. And this bear with me here, and I'll illustrate this with a picture in a moment. Morning light, so when you get up in the morning, it actually advances the clock. It'll make you get up earlier the next day. Whereas, of course, evening light delays the clock. You'll get up later the next day. So what we see in this cartoon here is, here's the light-dark cycle, here's dusk, here's dawn. This is somebody's wake period. And so light at dusk, they'll get up later the next day. Light at dawn can make people get up earlier the next day. And why this is important, and the classic example here would be teenagers. Because teenagers tend to go to bed late, and then they're sleeping through dawn, so they're not getting that getting up earlier phase. But of course, they're out in the evening, and they're getting the delaying light. So part of the problem of teenagers is that they're missing morning light but getting lots of evening light, and that's making them even further delayed. And we've just submitted a paper on this looking at students from all over the world. So when you time your lighting can have a big influence on your internal timing about when you want to get up and when you want to get to bed. And of course you can change your social jet lag. Technology to help vigilance. Paper published last year from the UK, junior doctors, 57% of junior doctors have actually had an accident or a near miss on their way home after doing the night shift. And I should say the shift work schedules in the US are worse than the shift work schedules in the UK. One junior doctor in Oxford said she once found herself on the opposite side of the road while driving home, and another poor woman died while driving home after the night shift. So again, what can we do about it? Well, there are these new drowsiness detection systems. Some of you may have them already inbuilt into your car. And essentially, they can tell you if you're falling asleep and give an alarm. So it seems to me obvious that there's a duty of care here by an employer to provide such devices to be fitted into the car of individuals who are driving home on the night shift. And this would have a big impact upon both the individual and, of course, society. Appropriate nutrition. I'm sorry to keep on showing you this. Night shift workers, cardiovascular, obesity, risk of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, gastrointestinal problems. What do we provide our night shift workers on the night shift? It's about the worst possible thing that we could provide them with. And again, this is low-hanging fruit. Why haven't we got available to our night shift workers healthier foods, high protein, low fat, low sugar, and easy to digest? Something we could do overnight. And the last bit is sleep education, letting people know about the importance of sleep and how they should prioritize sleep and how they may want to change their sleep habits. Can we use education across society for this? And so we've asked the question, will an educational intervention alone work? Will it improve sleep? And these are some unpublished data that we've been looking at teenagers. And we've developed an educational package for teenagers, which is addressed at sleep and well-being, with the science of sleep, what is sleep, why it's important, sleep hygiene, lifestyle factors, and stress management. And we've made this module available to teachers who've then taught it to their classes. And we've monitored the kids before and after the educational intervention. And so this is those kids, and about 40% of the class, of the cohort we looked at, were either poor or extremely poor sleepers. And if they had a score below 16, the chances are that they were showing quite severe sleep-wake disruption. So these kids were showing severe insomnia. And what about after the intervention? Look at that. There's a real improvement, which is highly statistically significant. And this is just a pilot study. And so I think this is very important because sleep education, not only in the school environment, but across society, could play a potentially really important role in helping individuals get better sleep and, I think very significantly, for partners to understand the negative changes in their behavior. And the last bit of information I want to impart is for shift worker couples with one child under 19 years old. The risk of divorce increase is up to 6 times higher when one of the individuals works between midnight and 8 a.m. as compared to daytime. The spouses need to know what's going on with the biology of their partners and why their behavior is changing. And I think that will be a very important, again, intervention. Okay, I finished. What I hope I've given you... Oh dear, sorry, I have overrun a bit. What I hope to give you some sense of is the extraordinary biology of sleep and its immense complexity. The importance of light, which is largely unrecognized, and the discovery of those new photoreceptors, which is transforming our understanding and our definition, indeed, of blindness. The impact of sleep disruption, which is occurring globally on our health. And all is not lost. On the basis of what we know now, we could start to change behaviors with key possible interventions. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. That
Thank you, Leanne.
was an amazing talk, and I very much appreciate it. We do have a few moments. I'd like to see if there's a couple of questions from the audience. Can't see. Oh, I think there's a hand back there. I'll start with Debbie here.
When you define quality of sleep,
Yeah.
is it measured in hours? I mean,
Yeah. Okay, so how do we know how much sleep we need? And there's huge individual variation. If you are dependent upon an alarm clock to get you out of bed in the morning, you need more sleep. If you're dependent upon stimulants to keep you awake during the day and keep you, and you're not falling asleep in the afternoon. If you are showing signs of irritability and you find yourself going through the red stoplight or jumping the stoplight, these are all signs that you're not getting enough sleep. And the critical one is if you oversleep when you're not working weekends and on holidays. And you need to prioritize sleep. And so a big chunk of it is sleep duration. And the extent to which the different stages of sleep, which I haven't gone into this evening, REM versus non-REM and all the rest of it, are important as well. But the devices that are commercially available to measure the various stages of sleep are not properly validated, and they can be quite misleading. So whilst I think you can use those devices for when you go to bed and when you get up and sleep duration, I gave a talk the other day, and this young lad came up to me at the end and said, "Do you believe in slow wave sleep?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, I don't have any." And it was because, of course, his particular device with his particular algorithm just didn't match his sleep patterns. So assessing what one's individual sleep needs are, I think, is really important, and you have to prioritize. So it's listening to your body, really. Yeah.
Is this on? Okay. With regard to that same question, is it true that the hours before midnight, if you're getting 7 hours, it doesn't matter if it's before midnight or after midnight? And I was told by my doctor that it's better for weight loss if you get earlier sleep in the night than later sleep.
Okay, a couple of really interesting points there. So the structure of sleep changes considerably across the sleep episode. There's much more deep sleep during the first half of the night and more REM sleep in the second half of the night. And deep sleep has been associated with memory consolidation and the processing of information, whereas REM sleep is more emotional processing. So the old idea that sleep during, before midnight is better, might, and I can only say might, be related to that. We don't have any really good data on it. The other thing about weight gain and loss is, and I took the slides out for obvious reasons because I was overrunning, is that the same amount of calories eaten during the first half of the day versus the second half of the day, you'll put much more weight on if they're taken during the second half of the day, because essentially you're burning up the calories as you go through the day, but the body clock is saying, hang on, no, you're not going to be burning up calories. I'm just going to turn these to fat and store them. So if you want to reduce weight, then have your calories dominantly in the first part of the day, and have a very light. What's the expression? Eat like a king in the morning and like a pauper in the evening. And that's interesting because that does seem to hold true. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do 2 questions from our overflow. The first one is, you mentioned that people with severe glaucoma are going to potentially have problems sleeping because of the loss of the ganglion cells. What would you say are some recommendations for them? They're not yet gone, but they are severe. What can you do to help them?
Well, the good thing about glaucoma is that it's picked up usually very early in most of the developed countries. And so in our studies, we haven't seen severe glaucoma. It's quite extraordinary. And so there has been no massive attenuation of those ganglion cells and no increase in sleep-wake instability. However, in places like China, glaucoma can be incredibly severe, and you can lose almost all of the ganglion cell layer. So clearly, if there's any hint of glaucoma, particularly family history or anything like that, get in there, make sure it's treated, and it can be treated very easily now, with drugs. And so just make sure you get it sorted out as early as possible.
Okay, and then we have a question here. It's really a 2-part question. What do drugs like Ambien and drugs like that are to help you fall asleep do to your sleep habits? And also, what do you think about the use of melatonin? Do you recommend it?
Okay, so it's not absolutely clear what some of the gentle drugs like Ambien are doing. They will sort of mildly sedate you. The impact on your memory and retention after just a periodic use of Ambien, I suspect, but we don't have the really good data, is going to be fine. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's only when you become chronically dependent upon large doses to sleep, sort of more anesthesia and sedation, we have very clear studies there showing big things are happening. I mean, it's interesting, intensive care syndrome, which is essentially where you're sedated for a week or more due to chronic illness. A lot of people will, when the anesthesia has been withdrawn, will actually then start having vivid and incredibly complicated dreams. And their processing of information has been completely wiped out for that period. So that's really not great. Melatonin is really interesting. So what does melatonin do? It's a biological marker of the dark. And in about 70% of people, if you take 3 milligrams of melatonin, it can reduce the time it takes to get to sleep. It is not a sedative, and it is not that effective. 30% of people do not respond. What it's doing isn't clear, but one thought is that part of sleep initiation is a drop in core body temperature. We drop about a degree, and that subtle loss of core body temperature might be quite important in getting us off to sleep. If you block that drop in body temperature, it takes much, much longer to get to sleep. And people have taken melatonin and then they've done thermal imaging on the hands to look at blood being shunted from the core to the periphery to lose the heat. And after melatonin, there's much more blood flow to the extremities, the hands, than if you don't take it. So maybe part of its action is to remove heat because it's vasodilating the vessels in the periphery. In the blind, there are a few detailed studies where kids who have retinoblastoma, which is a ghastly cancer whereby it's a very invasive and it starts in the retina, but it backtracks into the brain, and the only thing you can do is to remove the eyes. And there are 1 or 2 case studies showing that kids given 3 milligrams of melatonin at the local bedtime have partially stabilized the sleep-wake rhythm. And it's as if, the brain is looking for some structure, some signal. In the absence of light, it then probably pays a bit more attention to melatonin than it would otherwise. If you expose normal individuals with eyes to a light-dark cycle and you give them a weird melatonin cycle, they'll ignore the melatonin and always go to light, which is why the drugs we're developing are to mimic the effects of light on the clock, and we haven't explored the melatonin pathway because it's an unknown mechanism and it's not that effective.
Thank you very much. Okay, one more question.
I'm a chronic non-sleeper. 21 years, I sleep 2 hours, wake wide awake, 3 hours, and I wake wide awake again, and I do that all night long. And what can I do to get that continuous sleep we're talking about other than Ambien?
Yeah. I think we should talk offline because there's I'm not trying to dodge the question. It's just that there could be lots of different factors contributing to this, and it's very difficult to give a straight answer. There are lots of sorts of things generally one can think about doing about improving the quality of the sleeping experience. And I know I'm horribly going over now, but I'll leave this up. So if you want to have a look at it, and these are sort of developing good sleeping environment and limiting stimulation before bed. Those are some of the things. But in your case, you're waking up periodically, and that's probably due to a number of different things. So, for example, sleep apnea. The fact that the musculature of the throat and the tongue will flip back and block the airways can wake people up periodically throughout the night. But CPAP can sort that out, and it's about 95% effective. But drop me an email, and we can talk about some practical things. And Melissa.
Hi, Dr. Foster. I'm just curious, why is it that some people can go to bed at 11 p.m. or 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. and still wake up and get up at 7 a.m. regularly every single morning?
It's a great question. And that's because we're using our clock in a slightly different way. So if I might just digress and talk about bees for a moment. Bees use their internal clock to go to flowers which open their petals and their nectaries at a particular time of day. So they actually know, right, I go to that patch of flowers at that particular time and that patch at another time. And so they use their internal timer as a sort of almost a daily diary to sample things. And it looks as though we can also use our clock to anticipate the alarm clock. So many people say, well, hang on, I wake up a few minutes before the alarm clock. And that's because we're using the alarm clock signal, and the clock is then anticipating it on subsequent days. So we're using our internal clock as almost an events diary. Now, it doesn't last for long. And you'll see that when you go on vacation, you might do that for the first 2-3 days, but it'll fall apart fairly quickly, unless you have that reinforcement. Yeah.
It's just I hear about people all the time. They say, it doesn't matter what time I go to bed at
Yep.
night, I wake up every morning at
Yeah.
7 a.m. and get up.
Yeah.
Unlike myself, for example, I can sleep till noon if I
Well,
go to bed at 3.
yes. And the other thing, of course, is light, because the light coming through the curtains is going to be detected through the eyelids, and that can also be used as a wake-up signal as well. In fact, some really interesting, again, within the context of teenagers, using these dawn simulators to get kids out of bed in the morning, they look to work quite well. And so essentially what they do is they ramp the light up over a half an hour, and then the teenagers are actually using that to be woken up. So it could be light, but it could be also an internally consulted clock. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I have just a couple of quick announcements. A reminder that the cars are outside this building. Our valet is quite good, but if you want to take the time, go to the Pickens room and see our books. Also, we have on the tables in the lobby, we have information about our high performance cognitive training and our brain health physical and an upcoming sleep study. So please feel free to browse out there and see what interests you. Thank you.